welcome the Chancellor of the UK, Rachel Reeves, Kristrún. Give her a moment to come on. Kristrún Frostadóttir, Prime Minister of Iceland, and moderating the session, Rachel Sylvester, political editor of The Observer.
So this session is looking at the importance of economic security as a bedrock of progressive government. And we've got a really fascinating and brilliant panel of strong, powerful women, I'm pleased to say. Rachel Reeves is Britain's first female Chancellor, and as many people here will know, in her youth she was a chess champion whose trademark move was called the Sicilian defence, which sounds very mafiosi to me, but I don't think she's put any horses' heads in beds yet. And Kristrún Frostadóttir is Iceland's youngest ever Prime Minister, and in fact the youngest Prime Minister in the world, I think. She's just 37, not 17, a mother of 2 young children, and she's only been an MP for 4 years. And she heads a coalition of 3 parties led by women, which is known as the Valkyrie government in Iceland, which I love. So, Kristrún, do you think women do politics differently? You're not here as female politicians, but as you're both women, I think it's really interesting just to ask briefly.
That's a risky question. I do think yes. I mean, I think we can agree that inherently there are some differences between the genders, right? Maybe in Iceland people have felt it more because we went through a stage where we had sort of a traffic light government, left, green, center, conservatives for 7 years. And there was a big disagreement on policies for a long time there, and their qualms were sort of in the media for too long of a time, I would say. And so we took it upon ourselves we saw it as a big responsibility to just make sure that when you do conversations, you don't do them in public. You know, if you need to have a talk about something that comes up in a coalition government or within party, you have the respect for yourself and for voters to just get it done, you know, behind the scenes. And I think women, yes, sometimes have an easier time with confrontation. You know, it might be a spicy comment to make, but I don't have time to let something sink in for too long. If you need to discuss something on policy or something comes up, you just need to have a conversation. We've also been very good on communication. I mean, we're very respectful of each other, and we're aware that there's a lot at stake. We are governing around the center, and we know that if we don't deliver and we don't do things properly, we don't disrupt the systems in a controlled manner, someone else will come in and destroy them. So there's also that sort of weight on our shoulders. But the men are great too, and there are good men in our government, and I have no issues with them. But I think it's good to mix it up.
Rachel, I mean, we are at a unique point in politics, really, where it's so divisive. Their stakes couldn't be higher, really. The rise of populism, the far right, we had 150,000 people marching behind Tommy Robinson a couple of weeks ago, the far right football hooligan. Do you think that populism is driven mainly by economic factors, or is it cultural? Is it about immigration and people's kind of anxiety about change? How much is it economic?
Well, it's a bit of both, isn't it? And in the minds of a lot of people, they're very closely linked. So there's a quite compelling argument. It's not a correct argument, but quite a compelling argument from the sort of populist right that the reason why living standards have been depressed, the reason why public services aren't working well enough is because of immigration. Now, that's not the case. The reason why the economy hasn't worked for people for the last sort of 15 years is austerity, then Brexit, then the mini-budget, and then the external factors, COVID, the war in Ukraine, etc. But the argument of the sort of populist right is there are too many people in this country, too many migrants, some of them illegal, they are a drain on resources, and so our public services aren't working because they're using them, and wages are depressed because you've got these foreign workers coming in and undercutting British workers. So in the minds of a lot of people attracted to that politics, those two things are very closely intertwined. And that makes economic policy, I think, as well quite hard, because when I talk about sort of difficult decisions and the trade-offs, there are some people who will say, well, you know, actually, there's some very simple things you could do. Close the borders, don't let people in, and therefore would have more money for all the things we wanted and we'd all get a pay rise. That is obviously very simplistic and it's wrong, but that's why I think you can't really separate out the sort of, is populism on the rise for economic reasons or cultural immigration reasons? And I think the two are very closely linked. I would also say the issues around sort of, you know, concerns around the decline of the public realm and the high street, you know, again, in the argument of the populist right, those things are also linked to immigration. The shops that we used to go to aren't there anymore because they've been replaced by some other types of shops, or there's, you know, the people, you know, in our neighbourhood don't want to come out because they're scared. So I'd say that it is weaponised in that way that permeates not just a sort of discussion about sort of cultural values or whatever, but also the economic trade-offs.
What do you think? Do you date this back to 2008 and the economic crash as the sort of source of this underlying thing, or is there something more social, demographic going on as well?
I mean, I think there's I would answer it in the same way as Rachel. I think it's both. It's cultural and sort of societal change as well as the economy, because societal change and the economy are interlinked. It's not opposites of the spectrum. Yes, we went through a lot of difficulties after the financial crisis in Iceland, but what happened as well, which is I think a story that people don't know too much about, is that because Iceland is a small open economy, if there's a trend in the world, it becomes a mega trend in Iceland. So things go up really high and then they sink down very low very quickly. And so, for example, the biggest growth that we had post-crisis was in tourism. And that is, you know, it's a brilliant industry in a lot of ways. It can be very creative and you can use it in, you know, development across the country, and it's very sort of privately driven. But when you have labor-intensive industries, and I could name other than these that are driving growth, what happens is, for a small country or a country with a small population that's part of, for example, the EEA, because our immigration we have asylum seekers, but a lot of our immigration is from the EEA, is that we end up creating jobs, whether it's in tourism or in labor-intensive sectors where Icelanders might not be interested in. The salaries are not something they're interested in, and so you put out an advert and somebody else comes. And I think that's something that the government needs to have an opinion on. And if I can just quote something that Rachel did, because her secureonomics was about, you know, making the role of government more important, not talking it down, is that even though this is a private actor, it's going to impact your housing market, it's going to impact your roads, it's going to impact your healthcare sector, it's going to impact your language environment, because Icelandic is a small language. And so my point is that there has been an immigration change and a societal change in Iceland, which has, yes, pushed the housing market. It has done certain things because those that were running the industries were just thinking about people as widgets, not as people. And so I think at the end of the day, people want the government to have a control of the situation. They need to have control over immigration. They need to have control over how growth happens, even though they're not, you know, picking winners. And that's what people are asking for. At least in Iceland, from the Icelandic perspective, things ran hot and uncontrolled. That's a societal norm, but that's also an economic issue. So, you know, having control, I think, is a big part of it.
And you talked about reconnecting with the average person, and there was one interview, in fact, recently that said you were an advocate for the, quote, boring centre. Do you think that's enough for progressive parties to be sort of technocrats and managerial, or does there need to be more of a kind of imaginative vision?
Yeah, I don't know why they called it the boring center. I feel like I'm very political, even though I am an economist, and I'm not afraid to make big statements. However, I think you need to choose what you're focusing on and make big statements on that. So, I mean, what might be seen as the boring center is deciding not to divide the entire nation into 100 different types of groups, because that had been politics for a long time. And so you find that little edge and you put that person in it, and then you make these people fight. So you find something that brings people together, and then you're very political on that. So we're political on, you know, putting restrictions in the housing market so it's not financially driven. We're political on tax loops. We're political on welfare services. But it's based on not driving identities together, and I think maybe that would be a boring center today, but then that's okay. But to me, it's just smart welfare politics, and it's also really important today if you want to work against that polarization on the right. Don't over-polarize the left.
Yeah. And Rachel, you talked, as Kristrún said, about secureonomics. How has that worked in practice? And when you're dealing with a sort of very unstable global situation, how can you hold on to that philosophy? I mean, you've got a sort of madman in the White House basically tearing up all the potential of security for so many countries in the global economy. How do those two things fit together?
Oh, well, I think it's even more relevant than when I first made that speech 2.5 years ago. So secureonomics was about building a stronger and a more resilient economy in the face of an increasing number of global shocks that were affecting all of our economies. And actually, similar to Iceland, you know, we are also a small open trading economy, and so we are very exposed in the UK as well to global shocks, and we've seen that time and time again. But we're also particularly exposed to those shocks because we haven't managed to build up that resilience in our economy. And actually it's a theme in the meetings I have with finance ministers from other countries that share our values, that none of us have built that resilience into the system. You know, whether it was during COVID and we didn't have the protective equipment, or it was after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and we discovered how reliant we were on global energy markets for our very basic needs. And indeed, food price inflation went through the roof because we were very exposed there as well. And so secureonomics is about trying to build that resilience and security. And you just had John Healey speaking. You know, part of that resilience as an economy is having strong defences, and we've of course put additional money into our defence spending, taking it up to 2.6% of GDP by 2027, then up to 3% in the next Parliament. And that's because the world has changed, and we have to change what we spend on as a country. And we've made the difficult decision for a Labour government, for a centre-left government, to reduce international development spending, to put it into defence. But that is where there is the urgent need at the moment, and it very much fits in with that idea about building stronger and more resilient economies. But you can also see it manifest itself in other policies of ours, like, you know, we've just signed off to build the nuclear power station at Sizewell, as well as working with Rolls-Royce on building the small modular reactors. We took British Steel under public control because we couldn't lose that ability to make virgin steel in our country. We would have been the only G7 country without that capability. So that's all about secureonomics, building a stronger, more resilient economy, less exposed to shocks. But I guess this is sort of where other stuff as well in the world comes in. You know, as a small open economy, we can't do everything ourselves. You know, semiconductors is an area where, you know, the UK doesn't have huge strengths. We don't have access to many critical minerals. And so working with our friends and allies around the world is also crucial. So secureonomics isn't about sort of pulling up the drawbridge and saying we're going to do everything on our own, but it is about taking account of where things are made, who makes them, building those more resilient supply chains, as well as thinking more about our domestic capability and capacity, particularly in areas like energy and defence and some of those other foundational industries like steel.
And what about the trade-offs? Because I suppose the Achilles heel for parties of the centre-left over many years has been the sense that they can't be trusted on the economy. Do you think, Kristrún first, that governments have to be more honest both with the voters but also with their own supporters, that actually you can't have everything? And actually there are difficult choices, as Rachel referred to. What do you think? How have you handled that in Iceland?
I think it's better if you just own it. Because I think, I mean, I haven't been in politics for very long, but when I started out, I did this trip around the country because I felt Parliament was sucking me in, and I was just having conversation with people that agreed with me. And it really struck me how much distrust there was towards politicians, and people felt you were just saying what they wanted to hear. And so you just start saying, I mean, sometimes you say it in a nice way. You tell people how things are. Because then when you say something they want to hear, they know that you actually mean it. And the voter is smart. You know, you can talk to the public like a normal person, and they can tell if you're using fluff or you're saying something. So we have said, you know, we're going through a tidying up process right now. We are balancing the budget in 2027. We have done stuff like raise the resource rent fees, we're closing tax loopholes, so we're bringing in income, we're not afraid to talk about that. But because we also wanted to say we're not going to be watchdogs of the system, even though we're pro-government, we want the government to work. If we don't make, you know, disruptions where needed for the systems to work, someone else will come, rip it apart, and do it in an unorganized manner. And so we're not afraid to say, okay, this we will need to tidy up. This we will need to shut down. Should the government be doing this or not? So we can do things properly. And I do think if everyone is a little bit upset, then maybe people feel a bit better. As in, if the unions are a little bit upset at you and the corporations are a little bit upset at you, but you're doing a few things, but as a whole, you're getting ahead, it does give you some respect. Again, we will see where we'll be in a few years if this actually pays off. But it also makes you just feel better because you're confident that you're actually doing something that's going to work out. And I think, I mean, a big part of our project, at least on the Social Democratic Alliance back home, was that people would trust us to do what we said we were going to do. So you might as well just follow through. Because if you go through this term not having been able to deliver, then all of this would be for nothing, right? So being genuine about things gets you far ahead. It's not always easy.
So interesting. So Rachel, Kristrún talked about a lot of people being a little bit upset. You've got a lot of people a lot upset about a lot of things. MPs, the voters. Do you think actually, I think it's so interesting hearing how Kristrún talks about it. Do you think actually there's a time at the budget just to say, look, the world has changed. The promises we made in the manifesto on tax are no longer relevant. We need to have a really honest conversation with the voters.
Well, when we campaigned, just over a year ago, we said as a party, and it was a key part of our manifesto, that we would, stabilise the economy, that we would bring back some economic fiscal order to the economy. And, some people think that that was just for an election and that once we're in government, that somehow those rules can be relaxed. Now, I did relax the fiscal rules last year. We said we would balance day-to-day spending with tax receipts and that we would get debt down as a share of the economy, but subject to that we would invest in those things to grow the economy. As a result, we've been able to invest something like £120 billion extra over the spending review period on big capital projects. I mentioned Sizewell C, there's also rail projects, road projects, digital technology. But there are limits to what government can do. And at the moment, I don't know what the situation is in Iceland, but our debt to GDP ratio is basically 100%, just under. And £1 in £10 of everything government spends is on servicing the debt interest on the debts racked up, not by us, but by the previous government. I don't think there's anything progressive about spending £1 in every £10 of government money on interest often to foreign hedge funds and investors. But that is what we're doing today, and I want to reduce that. And there's two ways to reduce that. The first is by getting that stock of debt down, and we are on a path to do that. And the second is to bring down interest rates. Although we've had 5 cuts in Bank of England rates since the general election, longer-term borrowing costs are still too high, in part because inflation is too high, and in part because people can see that our public finances are still pretty precarious. And again, like Iceland, small open economy with our own currency. We're not the US, we don't have a reserve currency. We're not European Union, we don't have the backing of the European Central Bank. We are exposed, and that does mean we have to explain how we're going to make the sums add up. And some people sort of think that that is in tension with our Labour, our social democratic values. I would argue the exact opposite. There's nothing progressive about seeing interest rates go up again, because actually that takes money out of the pockets of working people and businesses that want to grow their business by borrowing to invest, and it takes money out of public services, because if we rack up more debt and we increase borrowing costs, we're going to end up spending more on those things and less on the things we actually want to spend on. We spend more money servicing government debt every year than we do on defence, the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice combined. That is not progressive, and I want to reduce those costs so that we can use that money to better effect. And that has meant, you know, that no one can accuse me of not accepting that there are trade-offs. That's why there are people who are unhappy. But if you pretend there aren't trade-offs, then we're going to go the same way that Liz Truss went, and that is, you know, crashing the economy, putting pensions in peril, sending mortgage rates spiralling, and not just losing election, but being consigned to total irrelevance, which is where the Conservatives are today. And, you know, it's only 3 years ago since that happened. Feels like a lifetime ago. It was several prime ministers ago now, wasn't it? But, you know, we've been through that. Well, bond markets, of course they matter. You know, and if someone else was willing to buy our debts rather than the bond markets, but I'm not exactly sure who that is, then we'd have to worry about them instead. But, you know, we are reliant on bondholders buying our debt, holding our debt, because otherwise we wouldn't have the money to finance the public services. And, of course, they would buy more debt if we wanted them to, but they would demand a higher interest rate on it.
So in terms of sort of levelling with the voters on tax rises, what's your answer to that?
Well, it's about tax and it's about spending, and it's also about economic growth. So if the economy had have grown at the average rate of other OECD economies over the last 14 years when the Tories were in, our economy today would be £140 billion bigger and would have £50 billion more to spend on public services. So, you know, yes, you've got to make sure, and we have got the rule to balance day-to-day spending with tax receipts, but also economic growth. And that's why we've said as a government that growth is the #1 mission, because that is the best way out of all of this. But we also have those trade-offs between tax and spending, including on welfare spending. And if we're going to spend more on that thing, then that means there's less to spend on somewhere else, or it means higher taxes. And there's no getting away from that. If we were in a different world where we'd inherited, like the previous Labour government did, a debt to GDP ratio of well under 50%, then maybe there'd be a bit more flexibility. But I'm Chancellor in the world that we are in, not in the world that we may wish it to be. And I have to make those trade-offs and make those decisions, not in the world that Tony and Gordon inherited in 1997, not in the world that Cameron and Osborne inherited, where actually debt to GDP was a lot lower, public services were in a good state, even though we had a budget deficit in that period. We've sort of inherited the worst of all political worlds. Some people say, gosh, what a terrible time to become Chancellor. But I would say, well, actually, in those tough times, it's even more important that we have somebody who's got a grip, has a plan, and knows what they're doing, and is not willing to be dragged off course by every siren call. I'll stick to that plan to grow the economy and to stabilise the public finances because, like what you just said, I know it's the right thing to do. And, of course, other things are available. I'm not sure if I would call them plans. Other options are available, but we've often tried that way before, and that's what's got us into the mess we're in today.
We're nearly out of time, but I wanted to finish with there's a lot of doom and gloom. As you say, it's tough times, there's a lot of difficult choices ahead. But have you got any reason for optimism? In what, I'm going to start. My reason for optimism is I think the advances in medical science are incredible, and the sort of genetic revolution that's ushering in this new age of cures is extraordinary and amazing, and that is a huge cause for optimism for me. Kristrún, what's your cause for optimism?
I guess I will answer this in a less high-tech way. I think you can't be in this job and do it properly if you're not an optimist. You are in this job because you believe that you can get something done for people, but what does make me optimistic is that when I have conversations with people, because we've tended to do this, I did this, when I was opposition, we still try to do this now, even though I'm in the Prime Minister's office. You do these big group meetings in bakeries, you meet people where they are. You get outside of the internet. People are a lot less pessimistic than you might think. People love their country, they love their society, they care for their neighbors, they want their kids and their children's children to do well, and they're proud. They have qualms with certain ways the systems are being run, and we need to take that to us. We need to fix that. So I don't think this attitude problem that we sometimes feel, that everyone is so pessimistic, is as deep as it is. However, I don't mean to sound naive about it. That doesn't mean that there aren't issues. You just need to approach them where people are coming from and make sure you're spending your energy on the right things. Don't be picking fights on matters that aren't inherently important to people. So that's why the economy matters, that's why housing matters, that's why day-to-day things matter for people, and then they just want you to get the job done. So I am positive that if we have the right structures in place and we just do the job properly, even though it's hard, people are at the right place. But there are easy solutions out there, yes, that are being they're honing in people, and we need to have an answer to that. And that can't be us denying that there were problems with the system, right? It can't be just, okay, it's stupid for you to think that there's an issue. But inherently, people are positive, they love their country, they want it to do well. Then we just have to get back into the office every once in a while and do the job.
Rachel, what's your reason for optimism?
So I think the time that I'm sort of happiest in my job is when I get off the train in Leeds and go back to my constituency. Because similar to what Kristrún is saying, you can get sort of trapped into the bubble here. And when I'm here, I meet people who, coming to sort of lobby me about a particular cause. And like all of them, important. But what you don't hear from much when you're in Westminster is the sort of people that we came into politics for in the first place. What I enjoy most in my constituency then is going into the schools and seeing the young people and also those who teach them. And I find that incredibly inspiring. And actually, all the things we've spoken about that you mentioned at the beginning about the division in society, that kicks in later. There's not that division when you go into schools. There's not that intolerance or that anger. There's a lot of excitement and passion, and if we could bottle that and we can keep that so the sort of cynicism doesn't, take over at some point, I am optimistic for the future. I think there are so many brilliant people and so many fantastic things going on that, I think you can't but be hopeful. But I guess the other thing I would just say I remember it was just not that long after the election, and I went into a school in my constituency, during the week I'd had, people come and lobby me about, don't do the non-doms thing in the budget, or, energy companies aren't really making that much profits, you shouldn't do the energy profits levy, blah, blah. I went into this school and I said to the kids, it was year 6, are there any questions you'd like to ask me? And this little girl said, it must have been September last year, so I'd only been in office for a couple of months, and she said, why is everything in the shop so expensive? And you think, actually, why is she saying that? It's because at home, her mum and dad are saying, you know, why can't we afford the things we used to be able to afford? Why is it, after paying the rent and paying the bills, there's not enough money? It's the beginning of the school term. Our daughter needs new shoes. It's almost a winter. She's going to need a coat. Why is everything so expensive? Why can't we afford what we should be able to take for granted? And that is, in the end, like, you know, there's all the big picture stuff that we've been talking about today and our progressive values. But in the end, like, what matters is at the end of our time in office, however long we're in our jobs, at the end of it, can we say that kids from ordinary backgrounds are living richer and more fulfilled lives than we came into office? And if we can say yes, then we've done a good job. And if no, it's probably about time that someone else took over.
It's a good note to end on. Thank you very much, both of you.